So it was like
I'm so
cornea
happy, I'm thrilled, actually,
surgery and stuff.
to
But it was
introduce
fine.
to you Claire Weisz, who's a longtime friend and colleague. She's a fellow of the AIA and a fellow with the Urban Design Forum, and holds a Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Toronto and an MArch from Yale. We were classmates at Yale, where it was clear to me then that Claire was passionate about how architects can make an impact and a contribution beyond the design of a single building. It's not surprising to me then that along with Mark Yos, another classmate of ours at Yale, Claire has for the past 25 years built a practice recently named the Firm of the Year by the American Institute of Architects, New York State. Weisz has developed her firm WXY, Architecture and Urban Design, into a practice focused on reimagining the interface between architecture, urban design, and infrastructure. Focused on innovative approaches to public spaces, structures, and urban design issues, the firm's work engages both site-specific design and planning at a wide range of scales. The firm's work in collaboration with community-based, public authority, and private clients. Their work embraces place-specific, resilient design to create new and repurposed buildings, piers and bridges, and urban furnishings for the public realm. Especially significant for me, and to me, is how she has led the firm's award-winning projects in infusing municipal architecture with civic dignity. A few of the public work projects that have won awards are the redesigned Rockaway Boardwalk, the reconstruction of Astor Place, a salt shed garage, and sea glass carousel at the Battery in Manhattan, and many, many, many others. The studio's work has been published broadly by Architectural Record, METROPOLIS, and on and on. Weisz co-founded the Design Trust for Public Space, New York City's premier urban design think tank, and has served on design juries both in the States and internationally. She has taught widely. This spring she was the 2017 Portman Visiting Critic at Georgia Tech, and a visiting critic this semester, now I believe, at Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning in New York, the New York campus. Lastly, Fast Company has named Weisz one of the most creative people in business for 2017 for, quote, specializing in retooling obsolete or inefficient systems for an equitable, sustainable future. So with that, join me in welcoming Claire Weisz.
Well, I know it's coming, well, it was midterms, but you're coming up towards the finals. So I'm not going to talk about too many projects, but I do want to talk about how us architects and how practice in the world today, and I'm going to use some of our work to illustrate that a bit. So, if you didn't, so who are we? So I have a firm, as Elizabeth mentioned, with 3 other partners, and I started it in, my God, 1993 after I graduated from Yale, but in a sense, the practice of architecture requires a lot of strategic thinking, and through that, in a sense, we've used, over the years, a kind of broad scale of design and systems thinking and brought it into practice. And really, it's through that I've come to a couple of conclusions. And one of them is that actually buildings on their own don't make a difference at all. And I know that's just a completely blasphemous thing to say in an architecture school. But basically what I want to say is that a single project or a single building is part of a trajectory over time. And that in looking at it, I think we as architects have to understand that it's also a moment in time and will be there for a long time, but it's not an end result. And in order maybe to explain this through 3 projects and a kind of theme for tonight, I really want to talk about processes that are incredibly important to all of us, but in a sense are invisible, and hopefully through what we do are made more visible. So I've organized this in sand, sea, and salt. I also want to kind of put some things I believe in out there. One of them is that public space is actually big. Even if it's tiny, it's big. It's a big idea, and it's an idea that actually binds almost everything that we all do together. The other thing I want to put out there is simplicity is actually, not that interesting. That places are actually extremely complex, and that isn't a bad thing. And that the embrace of an understanding of that complexity asserts itself in a lot of different ways. And then finally, the projects I'm going to show you are not about themselves. They're really about the neighborhoods they're in. And so it comes to the final kind of the 3, which is I believe that neighborhoods are unbelievably valuable. And that's both financially, that's socially, and that's in ways that we're yet unable to count the data for. And so the Rockaways, Spring Street, the Battery are all kind of locales for projects, but really they're more about the neighborhood. So I'm going to start with sand. And in each of these cases, I'm going to, because time is really important, I'm showing you a kind of video of a 5.5 miles of boardwalk. And I'm going to show you the next one. And this is some drone photography of it being occupied. I think one summer ago, actually. It just finally this summer, all 5.5 miles of it opened. And I think what's interesting is to think about it as, yes, a very large building, but not a building that anyone perceives. So I think the big question that we asked ourselves is, how do you design a line that's 5.5 miles long? Sounds like a first-year problem, right? I'm going to go back. I screw up? Oh, sorry. There. Okay, so now that you've seen the project, I can go backwards, which is, what's it really about? I think it's really about what we all share, which is summers on the beach, even if you don't live beside a beach. And this is not the United States, this is Italy, but I always go back, and I pull this off the internet, but I always look at pictures like that and think that this was a summer I had, even though I never, as a kid, got anywhere near summers like this. I lived on the prairie, so there was actually no ocean anywhere by. But actually, the beach for me and for our office is more like this. It's a highly contested space that is both at risk and derelict at the same time, where it belongs to everyone, yet people think it belongs just to them and they should decide, and that it requires a huge amount of regulation to do anything with it. Okay, so now we go precise. So Rockaway is in Queens, which is in New York City, and in 2012, every piece of the boardwalk was thrown into the neighborhood, and I would say 100% destroyed. Not that it was in great shape in the first place. There we go. This is what it looks like. So those kind of lines you see are just the piles that are left. It's a community that mostly is a community without means. There's a huge number of social housing, public housing, and nursing homes. And at the same time, there's a kind of very segregated population. It's only tied to the rest of New York City by 2 bridges. And if you look at where, with sea level rise, we're going to be, the Rockaways will probably not be around in 2100, but part of it will be around in 2050. And that's really true of a lot of barrier islands on the Northeast. Despite that, and like New Orleans, it was people's community. So I think as architects, even though we understand that maybe intellectually people shouldn't be there, where our solution skills are in, if they're going to be there, how do we make it safer? So as part of our work, we knew we were going to have the task to design the boardwalk, but first we designed a kind of community process looking at all the parks in the Rockaways and what their future would be. So all that green stuff you saw. And we ended up, of course, you ended up with renderings that look like this, but really the bay side or the other side of the Rockaways, we kind of took equal care in kind of recording through rendering. And I'm not convinced renderings are designed, but they're a great way of recording for people, kind of, especially in community engagement, a kind of decision moment where people agree that there should be a boathouse and they agree that you should be able to walk a trail safely. And this particular image I noticed because I was watching the news 2 days ago when it was the anniversary of Sandy. Mayor Bill de Blasio was in front of this image. This image is from at least 4 years ago. And he announced that he was going to spend $145 million more on these Bayside parks. It's another Bayside park. But the real kind of advocacy part of doing a project that is essentially simply designing a line, you know, it doesn't have mechanical systems, you're not making a roof, it doesn't have windows, but it has other things that are really good approximations of the struggles we have when we're looking at a building problem, is that there's human beings that have to get somewhere because they walk down the boardwalk and have to get to a beach. But there's a whole habitat that still expects to move from ocean to sand. So it's really, for us, it was important that we kind of built kind of recesses into this in the end. And then in the end, there's a kind of sand wall that has gaps that are big enough for habitat to move through and water to move through, but it slows down the sand. So in theory, it is a levee, but it's really a sand dune that has a kind of porous relationship about water, but it resists enough of the movement of sand to not have what happened on Sandy. We think, at least the engineers think, to have an entire sand dune end up on people's streets. So the concept was that you, instead of exposing the structure, you would make a dune out of it so that you could get a double dune eventually when the Army Corps finishes. And that all of those places of intersection had to be designed for a kind of new population that's coming out to the boardwalk. Surfers are coming back, people with strollers, people in wheelchairs. So the kind of idea of taking on this level of accessibility really drove it, because the boardwalk was about the level of the floor and we had to design it about the level of the stripe that's up at the ceiling here. So all of a sudden people's apartments were looking into something that they hadn't looked into before. So I'm just going to show you this is a system. It's really designed as though a big piece of structure is like a tile and makes a kind of large pattern. So instead of hiding the joints, we kind of made something out of them. And the sand was kind of gathered and put in to make the dune. And this is it over the past summer. Actually, this is a photograph just from a couple of months ago of the kind of new idea of the boardwalk. Because when we were in meetings with people, first of all, there was big protests because people like their boardwalks to be wood, and they're nostalgic for things that were yesterday. And somehow, as architects, we had to move the ball forward and offer something that as people said, this is our High Line. But what that was going to mean was open for debate. So we kind of used a strategy, a kits apart strategy, but a structure at scale, where these 30-foot long planks came in different types. The straight ones are supposed to be where you bike, and the curved ones are supposed to be where you walk. And we tried to make it sand color so it didn't look like a New York sidewalk. And in the middle of it, we spell Rockaway in big giant plank letters that you can see from the apartment buildings. And as you can see, you can kind of, if you know it's there, you know to look for it. Here it is at the end of the day. And then the boards that were salvaged from Sandy got reused as furniture that we used up as much as we could and designed all of these lounges. But all of the decks, the ADA decks, are recycled plastic lumber. And we had a chance to redesign New York City's standard water fountain during this process. And you'll see it right there. So you can kind of see what kind of raising, this is an idea of raising the grade and kind of creating a new place. And this shows you a little bit the kit of parts, right? There's straight ramps, there's seat walls, there's curved ramps to the beach that help the dunes stabilize. And there's some differentiation, but there's no control over what the parks that do come back in front of it will be. So in a lot of ways, I always talk about being able to look at a project and imagine letting go of it once it's done, and what do you have to do that? And in this case, considering the abuse it gets on a regular basis, it was really important to know that even during the process, you had to get in front of the questions. You had to ask the questions before anyone else was asking the questions. And you can see this, the dunes have grown in a lot. They'll still take about 4 or 5 years to get to where they were. And you can see this. And the kind of renderings also describe to people what the quality of the public space was on the land side. And I wanted to point this out in particular, which is the architecture of those ordinary moments. And this is the moment I talked about where a regular apartment building all of a sudden has a wall in front of it, and what that means. And so we didn't kind of shy away from rendering that and showing the fact that, you know, we did design a wall that people would look out for, and that there was a kind of ordinary railings we had to use, but that the kind of redesigning both of, I should go back, but the lights that were kind of put out, the boardwalk is very fraught, like everyone wants every inch. So one of the structural strategies was to use the arms of the structure to put the lights on. And this was a chance to kind of feature the work of another architect colleague, Tom Pfeiffer, who won a competition years ago in New York to redesign the city light, and no one could get it done. So we thought it was the perfect moment to order 200 of these lights and see if we could kind of gin up the market for it. And so they're all, actually that's a rendering, but they're all out there. So if you look closely at the pictures I'll show you later, you'll see them. So I wanted just to talk about a kind of strategy of signage on this, and Paula Scher was our collaborator on this and was able to make a font out of it. And so you can see that the idea was you could spell anything. In this case, we spelled Rockaways, but the hope is that someone uses it. And there's the A. And they did actually make these bags this summer, the Parks Department did, and the Rockaways to kind of give out to people. So in addition to this, there are the parks, and so the architecture rests in a way in a context. And this shows you some projects we were doing out there before the boardwalk. And this gets back to what I talked about at the beginning. about this sort of environment where I thought the be-all and end-all was this, basically, this stage that was like an arbor shade structure. And this came before the boardwalk. And in the end, and here was the comfort station. And in the end, I don't really see this as a project, but really as a series of investments in thinking about a neighborhood over time. And what the opportunity really out there it is, and this is now, you can walk from this building, which used to be fenced off. From the old boardwalk, you can now walk onto the boardwalk. And so all of these moments are now connected. Sometimes there are projects you don't get to do, and this was one of them. This was going to be at the end of the boardwalk. And that's also to say that I think there's a fallacy about what goes into a project where you make a model and you push really hard and it gets built. Sometimes it's fine to do all sorts of things that in order to think about what should and shouldn't get built. So that one is still out there. And here you can see the lights I spoke about by Tom Pfeiffer, the city light, and at night. It's very hard to photograph it, but the other idea was to talk about the microscopic, and I probably will. And my partner, Mark, and I are both into kind of looking at functions and processes that try and make people aware of things that you don't always see. And so there's aggregate that's glow-in-the-dark aggregate that's put into the blue letters in addition to the blue color of the concrete, which at night it glows. Because a lot of the plankton and other things have a glow at night. A lot of them are photoluminescent. And so that idea of knowing that you're part of a larger process, of course only the surfers really notice it because they're out when it's really dark. And so finally, this is kind of the range of glass and other aggregate that was used. So I'm going to move on to C. Let's see if that works. Oh, let me go back. There. So it's not very often that you find yourself designing a machine. So this is a machine that sits in the middle of a park that our practice spent over a decade kind of bringing back. And it exists because it used to be a nasty park, and we couldn't figure out why, so we did a survey of all these moms with strollers who wouldn't walk through it. And they all basically said to them the park looked dark. So in the master plan, we put this big circle that said there should be moving lights there. And it took us a couple of years to figure out what that was. And luckily, the kind of head of the conservancy for this park, a woman named Maury Price, who's from San Antonio, decided that you couldn't really come to the prow or tip of Manhattan, get on a ferry to the Statue of Liberty, look back at the world, the Freedom Tower, and not at least have an ambition for something that was of its place. So I basically first pitched an idea to her that this is, right over to your left was the home of the first aquarium. One of the first aquariums in the world, but the first aquarium in New York called the New York Aquarium. Robert Moses, when he dug a tunnel under this is all over a huge tunnel in subways, kicked the aquarium out to Coney Island, and as punishment, of course, for wanting to stay. And I thought that if you could create a ride that related to the original aquarium that made people, city kids who don't get to scuba dive, feel like they were scuba diving, you could sort of elevate the park. So the park wasn't just a place to walk through, it became back to its original destination. And that's what happened over a number of years. We got a chance to collaborate with Pete Outolf, who also did Millennium Park and the Battery, and people feel like they're in a botanic garden, and they feel so comfortable that they are willing to take naps in this garden. There's a huge homeless population that also doesn't get kicked out, but gets to use the public bathrooms, and that the park is in dialogue with. There's a kind of openness because there's no high-end residential anywhere nearby yet. So it's very much a park that people go to as a public place. So we basically, over a decade, changed bathrooms from looking like that to looking like this, and put, small architecture projects, pavilions, so that, again, it got back to this idea of remaking the landscape so that there was kind of this sort of bounce of light in them, including a fountain. So the kind of penultimate project for us was to do this. It's really a carousel, but it's not a carousel because the machine is below and the machine doesn't act like a carousel machine. It's almost, it's like a combination of rides. But the idea is that within a circular ride, if you get both enough axes of motion and you're able to do a yaw and go up and down, you can kind of make it feel a bit like you're weightless. And the weightless thing equates to the swimming thing. You saw a little, you couldn't tell, but you saw a little bit of that in the, and that through creating a structure that even in the daylight, we got enough light, enough shade to project. You could use projector lights and get a kind of oceanic moving light in it. And most importantly, you can kind of see it unfolded. We were hoping that as a microclimate, we wouldn't have to condition this at all, because the whole ride would act like a big fan. You'd bring in air low. You'd basically have a lot of cool air in this machine room we had below. And then we had a big fan that would suck air out the top, and that you could reverse it in the winter and you'd get enough heat gain from the solar. So the idea was to, and then you can see the louvers, was to kind of use it as a way to create, because most of these things are done black box, and they really don't have a lot to do with form and space. So I think the test for us was it possible to create an experience and still be in a garden, and look at the garden in a way as though it was the ocean. So, again, you'll have to go and see if we got there. This is a little bit explains the diagram of air movement and the models that we used. In the end, this is the machine. You can see it has one big wheel and then 3 small wheels. So one of our collaborators on this was someone trained as an architect who's a set designer now. He's an experienced designer. His name is George Siepen, and he has a George Siepen Opera Factory. And he looked at this project, and we were totally struggling with the issue of figures. And he immediately got it because we kept talking about portals. And he said, no, you're thinking about this the wrong way. You are the fish. You're not on the fish. So I think that was one of the more successful moments where the machine, through the figure and the building, became one idea. There it is. It transforms completely at night. The gardens around it were also by Pete Outolf, who kind of very purposely wanted to use a kind of perennial plants, but have that oceanic feeling. This is it inside, and there it is in the landscape. Okay, last project. Salt. So I'm kind of doing a little walkthrough of 2 pieces of architecture. It opened a year and a half ago. Actually, the last It's still in punch list, and the last garage has not actually moved into this yet. But this is a picture of what this was. So it looks like a perfectly ordinary New York street. And garbage trucks used to line up on the West Side Highway, and to your right was a small sanitation garage who those garbage trucks belonged to. And right behind it, you can start to see, behind the tunnel shaft, a building, a late Philip Johnson building that Annabelle Selvdorf finished up. And it was sort of that wave of market rate condominiums kind of settling in beside the last piece of industrial fabric. But a very important piece, because as you all know from ordering on Amazon, the entire UPS and FedEx infrastructure of below 42nd Street is all right there. So in a way, it was the more people move in, the more garbage needs to be collected. The seamy underside of how we actually function, I would argue, is one of the most important roles of architecture and architects. So anyways, the neighbors launched a lawsuit saying whatever that got put here would be way worse than what was there now. This is what's there today. Again, I'm showing it to you a little bit in, there we go, let's see if it moves. There we go. So it's a place of cars, but you notice there isn't garbage trucks sitting outside, everything's inside. So it's now much easier to walk on the sidewalk and walk to your soccer game. The story of this project, kind of like the story of the Rockaway and the story of the Battery, is a different but similar story. It's a story of a larger city and its processes and its infrastructure. On the left, you're looking at how New York City handles its recyclables. The project that I'm about to show you is the result of a lawsuit to get sanitation off the West Side Highway where people wanted to play ball and play soccer. Actually, the site is right across from the Whitney Museum. And the only thing left on that site will be recyclables. And it will connect to New Jersey, because the idea under Bloomberg was to share garbage and to not put all of the city's garbage from wealthier neighborhoods into poorer neighborhoods and add to their asthma rates. So the point was to get trucks off the street. And so when the wealthier neighborhoods here sued the city, which was to our benefit, backed sanitation up. And the only compromise was, and that was the planning director, not the neighborhood that said it, the planning director said, I want a really good building out of it. So in the end, what happened is that the salt shed was supposed to be in the main garage building, which would have been a bad idea. Never put salt in buildings. That should be like the maxim we all. And so in the end, UPS decided they had to stay. So UPS owned this site, and UPS granted the city of New York an industrial condominium, and all that orange is UPS. So you can see the city of New York has to go through this narrow neck and up ramps, and it's a vertical garage for the city of New York, and UPS gets the ground floor. And then the city, we took what was that little brick garage, demolished it, and made the salt shed out of that, so the game plan. And that kind of allowed, again, because you had the Public Design Commission and city planning who felt architecture needed to play a role, a kind of discussion about things like the angle of incline of salt, and whether, in fact, the smaller piece should be more like salt, and the bigger piece should be much more adaptive and about how the systems that sanitation uses all work together. And so in the end, that's why we ended up being able to do a kind of crystalline, single-purpose, throughput driveway, very tall, because there wasn't enough site to spread out the some 7,000 tons of salt, kind of wedge of salt. And really I think a lot, for me, inspiration in always wanting to work with sanitation was an artist, Meryl Euclides. I don't know if anyone here knows her work, but early, I'd say performance artist and installation artist who was interested in maintenance and honoring and kind of understanding. So she, I think it was in the 80s, chromed a garbage truck in New York City because she wanted the city to be reflected in the garbage truck, and she wanted to kind of honor the process and the people of sanitation. And there she is, and that you can see why at the time, like, no one was taking care of this stuff, and there she is. And in the end, I feel like we didn't get to do a museum of garbage here, which was there was some discussion about public access. There was no public access to these buildings. So unlike the last two projects I showed you where public space was in fact publicly accessible, this is public space and public building that has no public access whatsoever, but is of 100% benefit, I would argue. So there's a lot of pressure, in a way, on the relationships this building sets up with its neighbors. I think this is a really good image of it, because you can see that it is completely covered by a green roof that, again, no one can go on. It's nestled in. To the left is this what was it called? Anyways, the last Philip Johnson high-end condo. You get St. John's Warehouse, which is going to be converted to high-end residential. But there's a kind of, you can see the ramps and the louvers up against kind of as it goes down. And the higher part of the building goes up towards Lower Manhattan, which you'll see in a moment. The idea, this is a kind of our schematic design rendering. We collaborated with Datner architects who do a lot of work for sanitation in the city. And the idea was that it was a kind of, and you remember the first image I showed you, which I would call the non-gateway. The idea is that you were making a infrastructure gateway to the city, from the west side. And there it is today, off the bike path that you all heard about from last week, where this car careened down this very bike path. And that it's probably one of the only salt sheds that has architectural lighting, but I think it performs and the main garage doesn't have architectural lighting. We kind of just used the light that was part of because of the louvers, we could get away with it. But I think it's become a kind of icon, an unlikely icon because of that. And then there's a kind of role in terms of what highly constrained problem, and in what we could use with gates to try and do the same thing Meryl Euclides did by chroming the garbage truck, was to kind of make the name of Department of Sanitation New York into the kind of the thing. In a way no different than spelling out the Rockaways. And equally, there's a lot of moments, again, no people go in here except for the people that work there. There's still a kind of slight deflection of surfaces to try and make both the sidewalk and people going in a kind of openness to it. And that's a kind of straight view. The thing that appears to be a window, so both the south facade and the west facade, where you see a window, have are solar activated louvers. So they're constantly moving depending on where the sun is. And that's because those are the only spaces that are not only vehicles. People are working in those spaces. So those are the only spaces where the louvers move. And these are kind of, in a way, the architectural explanation of why two facades, to kind of create a sense of wholeness to the system, because I'm going to show you the inside. The way it works is there's some very, very tall spaces. Actually, we have one that's 35 feet floor to floor, typically 22 feet clear. And then you mezzanine the kind of locker rooms and offices and things like that. So you get spaces like this for people and spaces like this for people and trucks. And you can see the complexity behind it, and that's why in the end we decided to do a curtain wall and a louvered building, even though it went through a year-long value engineering process to try and convince everyone. But it actually came out more affordably than trying to do that in one move. And I think it gets to a larger argument in this space about how great redundancy is. And that explains that facade I showed you, that it just, that's where you kind of, the throughput is, and then you go right up the ramps to upstairs. And this is kind of how it nestles in what is now, you know, a burgeoning neighborhood full of UPS trucks and WeWork, as far as I can tell. And that these ramps are kind of to fit very large vehicles, and the same ramp has a green roof on it. And these are kind of this is in the fall or end of winter. And you're looking at Jersey City. And that's from the plan I spoke about, the sort of contested territory of this building, that really the public entrance of this building is for people and vehicles, but you still see through to the Hudson River. So someone walking by, and there is a sidewalk, can still see through the building. But really, architectural photography aside, these buildings are really about this kind of weather in New York, and about, even worse, hurricanes and storms and whatever else, because the Department of Sanitation basically has to clean up after anything. And so I really kind of enjoy the fact that these buildings come to life. They're 24 hours. They have I think they ended up being LEED Platinum because the city has a steam system, and so all of the recycled water was able to create this very large, all thermal system between a gray water system, between taking the heat off the steam and using it for cooling. So in a way, it is a hub for when other buildings aren't working, this part of the city will still function. You can see it kind of at night. This, believe it or not, is the sand that we use, which comes all the way from Chile. No, it's hard to believe. And this is it at night. So I want to just talk about the culture of projects. So the interesting thing about doing a building for sanitation, which is not the standard building for sanitation, is that it inspires people to do things with it. And this is during Fashion Week in New York, and a young fashion designer who collaborated with a uniform supplier who supplies uniforms to the city of New York to do a kind of fashion show there. And the money, there was some money raised, and it goes to the foundation for the Department of Sanitation. And I also, I think this was the beginning of the new year. There were, like, New York Magazine publishes, you know, silhouettes of New York. And it was more amusing than anything else was to see that a salt shed could become listed amongst all these other buildings, which, number one, have a lot more kind of public-private investment, but have a more complex function. So maybe getting back to that cities and places are complex, they also, in a way, are, when you get to that moment of understanding, people appreciate something that they understand or feel. So if really projects that we all get come from analysis like this, and out at the end pops the kind of building you're supposed to get once you know, right, actually the building is kind of in, and other are right in the pink. You know, architecture is kind of in the pink zone. People are generating waste in the blue zone, and then unfortunately for New York and for most of American cities, all we do at that point is spend a huge amount of money and ship garbage to landfills in a way that it's hard to believe as a society that we allow this to happen. So I think that doing this work has made me even more conscious of the kind of, really from a sustainability point of view, how saving buildings is delaying that kind of brown terracotta level at the end, and that in general we have to come up with, you know, garbage is a huge resource. We have to come up with, there's equity in terms of how we handle it, but there's really equity in terms of why are we shipping garbage to other environments, at least New York and the city. And on your left is kind of the form it gets shipped. And on your right is the human capital and the labor force that has to be actually pretty sophisticated about handling it. And between these two things is really, I think, the work of urban designers and architects and planners to really understand what we all want our neighborhoods, places, and cities to be. So hopefully that link leads me into kind of a summary a little bit about why I organized this lecture around very small things. And I think it's a lot about you architecture students and us architecture students, because in architecture you stay a student until you know, you walk off the stage. And I think what I'm thinking about lately is that life is a bit of a contradiction, and that you have to look really hard, because in most cases if you look really hard you can see something that you haven't seen before. And this, does anyone know what this is? So this is an array of diatoms. And it's an incredible little piece of art, but you can only see it under a microscope. And the Victorians basically used to collect diatoms and array them. And diatoms are basically single-celled creatures that live in glass houses. They are probably some of the most important organisms us architects and people depend on. We have glass because of them, because of the silica cycle. More carbon is sequestered in diatoms than the rainforest, I believe. But it's a part of, I think, our planet that we know very little about. But for a long time, people have observed them. So that kind of story about diatoms, which also I think connects the three elements I spoke to, gets to the fact that we have tools and kind of agency at this point to think beyond literally what you're seeing. I think that's really, as an architect, I think that idea is really important. Not that I know what to do about it, but I think it's an incredible challenge to try and see beyond the obvious. This is what diatoms actually look like under the microscope when they're not arrayed so beautifully. And I guess it gets into that first image and the second, which is for all of you that are in school right now and for those of us that are in practice, I think it's really, there's a huge amount of important pressure on all of us to invent new ways to see, because of what we do, what we care about, that others through our eyes are going to see the world a different way. And so I'm going to leave you with the fact that these things, whoops, I'm going to try again, are actually alive. And even though none of us actually know that they're there, We owe, glass to them, actually. Wouldn't be any glass in buildings without diatoms. So thank you. So do people get to ask questions?
Yes, they do.
You guys could have asked questions during my lecture. I wouldn't have minded at all.
Does anyone have a question for Claire? Yes.
So I just really appreciate how community engagement is on the same playing field as architecture and urban design. I'm still processing everything, but it's really interesting because you don't shy away from these highly contested spaces, and so you have this. I'm sure you have a range of opinions and thoughts, and you touched on some of those, especially with the rock design, and how people are really nostalgic about wood, and now they're looking at a wall. Do you feel like you're playing like this long game, and you're seeing people, average people who are not architects, who are not thinking about these things, but they're unpacking these ideas through your design, and like what does that engagement look like after the fact? I guess is my question.
That's a kind of long, complex answer and question, but I'm going to try and answer it two ways. One way is that in the kind of work where no one's told you it's a building yet, which is where most of this work starts, or told you it's not a building, because it could be a building, you, in a lot of ways, have to seek out problems and rather than try and solve problems. And so there's a lot of people out there who are ready to tell you what the problems are if you essentially are open and you're willing to treat them like a traditional client. So you're at a meeting and someone tells you a problem and you go, okay, like let's start drawing it. Not that you can solve it at the time, but if in a way you haven't yet figured out the problem and they have all the information in a lot of cases. So I think there's that critical. In a lot of cases, it's true, government agencies have tried to package the problem. And I think we've tried very hard to work out techniques to unpackage what they think the problems are so that it lets more people into the process at critical points where they need to be in the process. The other problem, I think what we're talking about, is that very little good design gets done by committee. And one of the worst things I see all the time is people coming into meetings and asking the community to like pick between two tiles, right? Or should this be, that color stone or this color stone? Like they're that very limited understanding of a client relationship. I think that what you really want to do is imagine that the person you're looking at either wants to ask the same questions of you as you, either has some stake in it directly, and is able to question why there's tiles in the first place, and isn't yet interested in simply picking the color of the tile. I think that is really important. The other way I would answer it is that one of the reasons I kind of showed sea glass also is that I feel like and maybe it's true of the sanitation garage, is that children in particular are the ones ultimately who are going to be making neighborhoods and cities. We hope that many of them, well, if they don't become architects, will really want to engage in architecture, which means that we have to start putting out public space and public buildings and regular buildings that are engaging enough for them to look at and go, hey, what's that? And if most of our environment is not kind of challenging or engaging, and that's for, then I think we have lost an opportunity.
Other questions?
Go for it.
Those three projects with such a diverse content. I'm curious about, because they are all public projects, how does work in New York? I mean, is it, you get those commissioned by doing competitions? Is it an open for tender? How does it work?
Okay, so it's all those things at once. So if I look at we tend to invest in neighborhoods, so sometimes it starts by finding a neighborhood and doing a small project. And then you hear there's an on-call for another project. So in most cases, there's a kind of investment over time. The Rockaway Park was originally a competition amongst landscape architects, and we happened to be the architects on the team that won for those pavilions and stuff. And the Rockaway Boardwalk, interestingly enough, was a competition amongst engineers. But the engineer that called us needed an idea of how they were going to deliver the structure within the 3 months that they were required to deliver it and get it built, because it was all about schedule and budget. So because we had a good relationship with this one marine engineer, we essentially diagrammed what ended up getting built, not the colors and not the kitted parts, but the structural system we diagrammed in order to win the engineering commission. So that was kind of interesting, because generally you don't start with a structural system and then try and work backwards. So we had to figure out, and there was no curved planks or anything. What there was the idea of doing a precast system about that size and getting a dune as part of the package. There was no design other than that. So I think that most of this kind of work, which isn't a normal procurement process, is composed of a number of different kinds of procurement over time.
Okay, other questions? About in the back and then here in the Hanan.
Go for it.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm really interested in the Department of Sanitation project. How you were able to convince the city to spend money to go more architecturally than going with one of those firms that would typically do the work probably for less money, since they have a reputation for doing that. And where you see the future of those kinds of projects coming in, do you think that it's because New York is more of a city of symbols that this could become more of a pattern in the future?
Okay, so that's an interesting story to tell. So, except for salt sheds, which are generally big tents actually in New York that don't perform very well, these sanitation garages already, because of how constrained the space is, are and are at least $100 million when they built them. And they mostly are close to $200 million. And that's for architecture that's not distinctive at all. So both the sanitation garage and the salt shed came in under budget and in schedule, which there's still 2 garages that started 5 years before ours that are still not finished, if you can believe it. So, and our collaborators, Datner Architects, have done a number of those other garages. So they were very practiced in exactly whether this height could work. And we had a different scheme that was sort of a double ramp scheme that got thrown out because sanitation said it was going to be cheaper this way. So I think that the issue is, how do you convince the public that once you're investing to invest here, which may be different than Texas, but in New York, no one wants to maintain buildings. So the Office of Management and Budget, you do this very intense calculation about what it's going to take to maintain a building over 25 years. You add it to the cost of the building. And that's how they okay funding. Because they've just, the city of New York has gotten burned over and over again. So if you have a kind of crappy building and you go through the calculation of 25 years, that number really adds up to the actual budget of the building. So that means that no matter what in New York, a civic industrial building, you're going to spend a lot of money on. And then the question becomes how you spend that money. And, you get into things like taste and whose taste it is. And that's why, and most people, I think, even looking at the drawings and plans of those two buildings, would have rejected them. But you have other architects in New York. You have the Public Design Commission. In this case, Jim Polshek sat on it. And he was really, it's to his credit completely, those two buildings, because he basically said, no, 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 better, more, cleaner, you know, and we want to see what the architects care about. And in this case, you also had a planning commissioner, Amanda Burden, who felt that the negotiation with this lawsuit meant they had to deliver a building that became part of the neighborhood. You could have a lot of preconceptions about what would have matched the neighborhood, but the neighborhood is, most urban neighborhoods are so diverse in terms of building types that I think as architects, you do have to do something that responds to something new. It's very, you rarely see, in New York has very few neighborhoods where all the buildings look the same, that you have to match it. Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a little bit more about the salt shed. I know you mentioned that it was based on salt crystals, the form, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about the process of how that came about, what tools you used.
So, not that complicated. There was a process, schematic design process, where thousands of different, you know, we did ones that had louvers and matched the building, and we did ones that were, I think I showed a model of it, were kind of crinoline but more straight, because salt crystals are kind of straight. And then we tried, and again, this was in response to fellow architects' criticism in this case. So Jim Paul, you had meetings every 2 weeks and you'd get a crit, kind of like in school. And you'd go print some 3D models and everyone would look at them. Because we'd already designed the main garage. We knew the hall and tunnel. So it was very clearly a problem where we knew how you were getting in and out. We knew that the site was shaped, but we also knew we had enough room that we didn't, unlike most things in New York, we didn't have to match the lines exactly. So if you look at the plan of it, which I breezed through, it doesn't match the property lines. And in fact, the building, what we all wanted to achieve was this gateway thing, is when you walked into the building, the lights are in this sort of glass thing. We wanted the structure to feel like you were in it, so it leans out towards you. So that's why it has that innie on the one side. It kind of pushes in. So in a way, it was like deforming it. Once you have it set, we wanted kind of a larger, salt crystals tend to kind of cluster in these big chunks. And then, so we kind of made it deform a certain way on the side that would face the building and deform a slightly different way on the other side. But it was, a bunch of crits, and then that was it. And the rest of it was, again, about writing a spec and going through a very long construction process. And the exciting thing for all of you that are now, like if you design something, this has happened a couple of times when we've been able to use poured concrete as opposed to precast, where you go to the factory, you see it exactly, it's super controlled. Concrete is one of the least controlled architectural experiences you can have. Like, you do it, you hope that someone's following the specs, you look at the test things, and then you basically just pray. And it gets pulled off, and either like someone screwed up or they didn't.
David?
So I really like to talk to you. I found it really kind of refreshing and actually it's kind of intelligent. I had missed, which is like kind of Venturi, Scott Brown kind of stuff. I actually really like a lot. So thank you so much. I had a kind of question just like listening. You talked about renderings too much, and every time you talked about renderings, it was like you had this kind of moment of like, okay, it's just like this is the evil cost of humanism. It's rendering somehow. And I wondered if you would just talk us a little bit more about how you, or there's an ambiguity, like there's ambiguous feelings about, and then I wish you'd talk a little bit more about them, because I feel the same way about them. I've been trying to unpack them in my own head.
Well, I think it's because our practice is really kind of strategic, communities, industrial design, and kind of architectures in between. And in a sense, I feel that renderings don't represent buildings very well, but they do a really good job at representing a situation for people that they can relate to and understand. So the ones I show are kind of urban situation renderings, like.
Is that, and if you're happy about that or not so happy?
No, that I'm happy about, but I'm not happy about when people look at it and say, oh, that's your building. Because I think, I mean, for us, and I think it's true of Mark too, that it's really between physical models and drawings, conventional drawings, that you know what the building, that you test the building. And in most cases, the kinds of renderings we like are the kinds the general public detests. They're much more abstract, they're much more analytical, and we find we show them to other architects when we go through a process of the other architect having to approve it. But we don't show them in public because the public is used to photorealistic renderings, meaning real, whereas I don't really like them for architecture. And in a lot of cases, we use hand drawings to try and get through that. But I find it's at an urban or regional, like urban scale, it's very effective. I look at, even when I look at through architecture magazines now or Architect's newspaper, and I see so-and-so's renderings, and I look at them and I'm always disappointed. And it doesn't mean that I'm disappointed by the building, but I find myself being disappointed by renderings right now. And just to kind of give you all some background, so when I first graduated from school, I worked for Charles Moore in Los Angeles, and one of my main job was basically to watercolor competition renderings. You know, like you'd do these giant watercolors and you'd put them up and you'd present them, and I have to say that that way of kind of, and those were renderings of the time, like that was how people you did it, that still there was an aspiration to those that I think it was easy for people to read in watercolors. I think it's very hard for people to read in renderings what you're really telling them. In most cases, people like to look at what people are doing, what the trees, like they're not looking at what the architecture is. So then if you try and explain to a group or a client, oh yeah, see the brick is trying to do this, and they kind of look at you blankly because they're looking at the other parts of the rendering. It's my take on renderings right now. I'd be interested in what students think about renderings, but go ahead.
How about one more question?
Go ahead.
No, do it.
Why not?
It's not going to be that interesting. I was just wondering, so your main opposition to renderings is based on the photorealistic side of it, and I was wondering, okay, do you have the same reaction then so it's not the fact that it's like a single perspective image of the building, so in which case you would or you don't have the same reaction with photography of the building afterwards?
Well, you can see that one of the reasons I show a lot of different photographs from different angles and why I show video too is to kind of try and give people the sense of being there, because I think I love architectural photography, but it's giving you a number of different meanings. And you know, it's not that I don't think renderings are incredibly interesting, and in fact it's worth working a lot on them. I just feel like it's unclear. You have to be really clear on what you're saying with it, but in most cases the reaction to it has very little to do with what you're trying to say with the rendering. And that is due to the kind of photorealistic nature, I think, of it. It was very interesting, back to renderings. During, we did a resiliency competition after Sandy, in New York, and we did a lot of renderings which were like stormy skies, unpleasant, kind of like those winter photographs. And we were all really into them because it was supposed to be about kind of the risks that people, and not a single person wanted to look at them. They just wanted to look at various resiliency strategies with the sun shining. So there's something, I think, about the human impulse and these images and how we use them now that I think as a field we have to kind of work through.
Thank you again. Thank you, Claire, so much.
Thank you.